They called my teacher a savior, a messiah. They said he could mend any sickness, that he could command the very storms to be still. But in that moment, standing in the heart of a downpour that sought to wash the kingdom of Ethel clean, with the cold, unforgiving hilt of a knife in my hand, my enemy, the man who had shattered my family, cowering and helpless before me, I realized a terrifying truth. My teacher's greatest miracle was never meant to save others. It was meant to save me from the demon roaring inside my own chest. How did I, a simple fisherman, end up at this precipice of life and death? How did this enigmatic man, this teacher I had come to love and follow, lead us all to a conclusion that no one, not even his closest followers, could have ever foreseen? This story is not what you think it is. It isn't a distant myth. It is a confession, a journey of breathtaking hope and bitter tears, with one final devastating secret that will forever change the way you think about power, about sacrifice, and about the true meaning of forgiveness. Before we turn the first page of this memory together, I want to feel our connection across the void. I want to know where you are in this world as you listen. Leave me a comment below. Tell me your city and what time it is for you right now. I want to feel you here with me from every corner of the globe as we step into the story that redefined my entire existence. My story does not begin with a thunderclap or a great omen. It begins with the suffocating silence of the kingdom of Ethel. Ethel was not a place of joy. It was a realm governed by a sanctimonious fear that wore the mask of piety. Our order was kept by the Synod, a council of elders in gray robes with faces that seemed carved from stone and hearts wrapped in scrolls of ancient law. To them, the law was absolute, and any deviation, any flaw, any difference was branded as unclean, a stain to be scoured away or cast out entirely. We lived our lives in the long shadow of their edicts, learning to bow our heads, to whisper our thoughts, and to bury our private griefs where no one could see them. And then Elias came. He did not emerge from the capital's gilded gates or from a noble lineage. He came from the barren outskirts, a place where stones were more plentiful than grass. He didn't have the look of a holy man from the tapestries. He was just a man with a carpenter's calloused hands and a quiet strength in his slender frame. And his eyes, God's, his eyes. They held the deep, unnerving stillness of a forest pool, and they seemed to look right through you, not to judge, but to understand. He spoke little, but every word he uttered seemed to carry an impossible weight. The first time he truly entered my world was on a grim afternoon when a pall of death had settled over my village. The potter's son, a boy with more life in him than any of us, lay dying. The elders had already pronounced their verdict, a curse, a punishment for some forgotten sin of his ancestors. They forbade anyone from approaching the home lest the impurity spread. His mother's cries had been worn down to a hoarse whisper. His father stood numbly in the doorway, a hollowed-out shell of a man. The rest of the village watched from a distance, a silent chorus of impotence and fear. But Elias did not watch. He moved through the crowd, which parted for him as if by an unseen force. He spoke no words of law or sin. He simply walked into that humble, desperate home, knelt by the child's bedside, and gently laid his hand upon the boy's fevered brow. I remember holding my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was an act of profound madness, a direct and public defiance of the Synod's authority. And then the impossible happened. Beneath his touch, the searing heat seemed to recede. The boy's pale, waxy skin slowly regained its color, a faint blush of life. His listless eyes fluttered, then opened, looking up with a child's clarity at the stranger beside him, and he spoke, a weak but clear whisper, "Mother." A collective gasp swept through the crowd, a wave of disbelief that crashed into whispers of astonishment. That day, no miracle was performed with lightning or celestial choirs. There was only a touch, a quiet act of courage, and a life reclaimed from the edge. The rumor of a man who could defy curses began to spread, not as a shout, but as a ripple of hope in a kingdom slowly dying of its own fear. That ripple soon became a current carrying the name of Elias into the desperate coves and impoverished alleys of our land. He did not seek out the halls of power. He sought out the broken places, the places where we, the forgotten, lived. I saw him at a wedding in a coastal village where the young couple was so poor that the celebratory wine had run out, leaving them in a state of quiet public shame. Elias was there. He didn't preach a sermon on thrift. He simply, quietly, asked the servants to fill the great stone jars with water. And from those jars flowed not just wine, but the finest wine any of us had ever tasted, rich and dark and full of a warmth that had nothing to do with alcohol. Joy was restored to the feast, not because of the drink, but because they felt seen, because their small, human happiness mattered to someone. And for me, for my brothers of the sea, he came on our darkest night. After an entire night of casting and pulling, of aching muscles and strained ropes, our boats were as empty as our stomachs. The specter of debt and hunger was a cold fog that clung to us. Elias was standing on the shore as we docked, his silhouette framed by the first gray light of dawn. He watched us, his gaze filled not with pity, but with a profound understanding. "Cast your nets on the other side just one more time," he said, his voice calm. We scoffed. What could a carpenter possibly know of the deep waters and the fickle habits of fish? But there was a command in his stillness that we could not disobey. And when we hauled the nets in, they were heavy. So heavy they felt snagged on the very bedrock of the sea. It was not seaweed. It was the thrashing silver weight of fish. Thousands of them, a shimmering, living mass of silver that threatened to tear our nets to shreds. We had to signal a neighboring boat to help us, and even then, both vessels were filled to the point of sinking. Standing knee-deep in that impossible bounty, that sudden, overwhelming grace, I looked at Elias. He wasn't smiling in triumph. He was just looking at us. And I felt it then. He hadn't just given us fish. He had given us a reason to believe that even in the most profound and desperate darkness, a dawn was waiting. The common people, the outcasts, the ones Ethel had written off, began to gather around him. They didn't see a magician. They saw a brother, a friend, a tangible hope. Of course, this current of hope eventually washed up at the stone feet of the synod. The high elder, Theron, a man whose face was a mask of rigid piety and whose heart seemed insulated by scrolls of law, heard the stories. He dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "The parlor tricks of a vagrant," he declared to his council. "Cheap illusions to bewitch the ignorant masses." He failed to see that the fire Elias was kindling was not one of illusion, but of human dignity. It was in those days that I, Kael, a fisherman, whose hands were more used to mending nets than clasping in prayer, decided to leave my boat behind. But I was not alone. Reese, a young man who had always sought truth in the dusty quiet of libraries, also walked away from his books. We began to follow Elias. We were a study in contrasts, the man of action and the man of thought, both drawn to the powerful silence of this carpenter. We thought we were following him to witness more miracles. We were fools. We didn't yet understand that we were the ones who were about to be unmade and remade. Our journey with Elias swiftly moved beyond the realm of joyful miracles. It entered the territory of open defiance. He was no longer just healing fevers or filling empty nets. He began to touch the untouchable, the people and places the whole of Ethel had cordoned off with fear. I will never forget the day he walked into the leper colony outside the city walls, a place of living death where the afflicted were forced by law to cry out, "Unclean, unclean," at the approach of any healthy person. They were ghosts in their own lives, disowned by family, forgotten by society. But Elias walked into that desolate place as if he were walking into a garden, the most ravaged of them, a man whose face had been eaten away by the disease, dragged himself forward and whispered from behind a tattered cloth, "Teacher, if you are willing, you can make me clean." I expected Elias to utter a word from a safe distance. Any sane person would have. But he did not. He did something that sent a shockwave through my very soul. He knelt in the dust, reached out his hand, and he touched the man, a firm, gentle touch. No revulsion, no fear. "I am willing," Elias said, his voice a low balm. "Be clean." Instantly, the corrupted flesh began to reform. The raw, open sores closed over. The gnarled fingers straightened. A new man was reborn from the ashes of his own decay. And then Elias sat with them. He broke bread with them. He ate with them. That single act was a declaration of war more potent than any sword. It was a direct refutation of the synod's entire system of purity and separation. He was saying to the world, there are no unclean people, only people in pain. For me, however, these acts carried a second, darker meaning. I was not following Elias out of pure faith. Deep within me, a cold, hard knot of hatred had taken root years ago and refused to die. My younger sister, Lyra, bright and full of laughter, had been violated by the son of a powerful elder in the synod. To cover his own son's crime, the elder had used his influence, his web of laws, to brand Lyra herself as the seductress, the unclean one. She was cast out, and she died alone, in shame. That injustice had carved a void in me that nothing could fill. Every time Elias defied a law of the synod, I saw more than just compassion. I saw power. I saw a weapon. I began to believe that he was gathering a following, that these miracles were just the beginning of a revolution that would topple the hypocrites from their high seats and make them pay for what they did to my sister. Meanwhile, Theron, the high elder, could no longer afford to be dismissive. He began to see Elias not as a vagrant, but as an insurrectionist, a fundamental threat to the very fabric of order he had dedicated his life to upholding. The game had changed. He dispatched his spies, not just to watch, but to probe, to find a weakness, a flaw, any pretext to extinguish this growing flame before it became an inferno. The confrontation was no longer a matter of if, but when, and it was brewing in the charged air all around us. The power that flowed from Elias was like a river in flood season. It could not be contained by the flimsy levees of law or slander. It grew, becoming too immense to hide, too profound to ignore. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. One afternoon, as we were crossing the Great Lake in a fishing boat, a storm fell upon us out of a clear blue sky. The heavens turned a bruised purple in an instant, the wind howling like a caged beast, and the waves, tall as hills, rose up to swallow our fragile vessel. We were seasoned fishermen, men who knew the moods of the water better than the faces of our own wives. But this was different. This was a primal fury. We were terrified. We fought the rudder, wrestled the sail, but it was useless. And in the stern, Elias was asleep, sleeping as peacefully as a child in its cradle. His tranquility in the face of nature's rage was so absolute, it felt like a mockery of our terror. I screamed at him, my voice shredded by the wind. "Teacher, do you not care that we are about to drown?" He woke slowly, not with a start, but with a gentle stirring. He looked at the storm, not as an adversary, but as a father might look at a tantrum-throwing child. He raised a hand and he spoke. His voice was not loud, yet it cut through the din of the tempest like a blade. "Peace, be still." And it was. The wind died. The waves flattened. The lake became a sheet of glass in a heartbeat. The sudden, deafening silence was more stunning than the storm itself. We looked at each other, then at Elias, a cold, terrifying question forming in our minds. What manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? That power was not limited to the elements. Days later we found ourselves on a desolate hillside, surrounded by a multitude of thousands who had followed him for days, listening to his teachings. As dusk fell, they were exhausted and famished. Our entire stock of food consisted of a few loaves of bread and a couple of dried fish, not even enough for our own small group, let alone a sea of faces. Reese, ever the pragmatist, suggested we send them away to find food in the surrounding villages. But Elias said, "You give them something to eat." We were stunned. I protested, "Teacher, even with a year's wages, we could not buy enough food for this many." He simply asked us to bring what we had. He took the meager loaves, looked up to the sky, and gave thanks. Then he began to break the bread and hand it to us to distribute. And a quiet, continuous miracle unfolded. We would take the bread from his hands, walk into the crowd, and when we returned, his hands were full again. The bread simply multiplied. It flowed from his hands in a silent, unending stream of provision. Thousands of people ate until they were full, and when it was over, we collected the leftovers, and there were more baskets filled with fragments than the loaves we had started with. Standing in the midst of that gratified crowd, I was overwhelmed, but a new, dangerous thought began to crystallize in my mind. With this power, we could feed an army. We could overthrow the kingdom. The conflict within me sharpened. While Reese saw a spiritual master, I now saw a revolutionary general. I believed his mission was not merely to teach, but to conquer. And I, Kael, would be his sword. I was too blind with my own ambition to see that a sword of vengeance has two edges, and one was already turning silently toward my own soul.
Glimmer.
It was on that very lake, where the storm had been silenced, that the schism in my own faith was put to its most brutal test. On another night, after Elias had dismissed a crowd, he instructed us to take the boat and cross to the other side ahead of him, while he went up a mountain alone to pray. As our boat reached the middle of the lake, a contrary wind rose against us. It wasn't a violent storm this time, but a relentless, grinding struggle. The waves slapped against the hull, the wind pushed us back, and for hours we rowed with all our might, making almost no headway. We were exhausted, frustrated, and our spirits were low. Then, in the pre-dawn gloom, a figure appeared, walking toward us, walking on the water. A primal terror seized us. "It's a ghost!" someone shrieked, and we huddled together, our hearts frozen, but a familiar voice cut through the mist. "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." It was Elias, striding across the waves as if they were solid ground. In that moment, the laws of my world dissolved, and an impulse, a desperate need to prove myself, surged through me. I wanted that power. I wanted to be like him. I wanted to show him that I was his most devoted, most worthy disciple. "Teacher," I yelled out, my voice trembling, "if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Reese looked at me as if I had lost my mind, but Elias simply smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and said one word, "Come." I took a breath that felt like it was stolen from the wind itself, and swung my leg over the side of the boat. My foot met the water, and it held. It was solid, like packed earth. I took a step, then another. I was walking on water. A dizzying sense of power, of invincibility flooded my senses. I looked at Elias, and in my mind's eye, I saw myself at the head of an army, avenging Lyra, cleansing the kingdom. But then I made the fatal error. I took my eyes off him. I looked down at the churning waves of my own hatred and doubt. I thought of the face of the man who had wronged my sister. I thought of the injustice, and in that instant, the water beneath my feet gave way. Fear, cold and absolute, shot through me. I began to sink. "Teacher, save me!" I cried out in panic. Immediately, a strong hand gripped mine and pulled me up. It was Elias. As he helped me back into the boat, drenched and shivering, he looked deep into my eyes. His voice held no rebuke, only a profound sorrow. "You are not fighting the storm out here, Kael," he said softly. "You are fighting the storm in here." He tapped his own chest. At the time, I didn't fully grasp his meaning, but a seed of truth had been planted. I was beginning to understand that his power was not a thing to be wielded like a weapon, and that the real war he spoke of was not against the Synod, but against something far more intimate and treacherous. Still, the fire of my vengeance burned too brightly, and it cast long, dark shadows over that precious lesson. Brr. The confrontation we all knew was inevitable finally came, not on a battlefield, but in the sanctimonious heart of the Synod's great hall. They could no longer ignore Elias. His influence had become a direct challenge to their authority, so they laid a trap. On the High Holy Day, a day when the law forbade any form of work, including healing, the Synod invited Elias to speak. It was no invitation. It was a summons. As we entered, I saw their scheme laid bare. A man with dropsy, his body swollen and grotesquely bloated with fluid, had been deliberately placed directly in Elias's path. The trap was elegant in its cruelty. If Elias ignored the man, he would be seen as callous by the people. If he healed him, he would break the holy law, giving the Synod the justification they craved to condemn him. Theron stood on the dais, his eyes like chips of flint, waiting. The hall was thick with a tense silence. I could feel the eyes of every elder, every guard, fixed on my teacher. Elias stopped before the afflicted man. He didn't look at the trap, he looked at the suffering. Then he turned, his gaze sweeping over Theron and the entire assembly. He did not wait for their accusation. He posed the question first, his voice resonating in the cavernous space. I ask you, the masters of the law, on this holy day, what does the law permit? To do good or to do evil? To save a life or to destroy it? A wave of silence. They were cornered. Any answer would be an indictment of themselves. They were caught in the gears of their own merciless logic. Seeing their silence, Elias turned back to the man. He placed a hand on him, and instantly the swelling subsided. The man's body returned to its normal form. After the man had departed in tearful joy, Elias addressed the Synod again. This time his voice was not a question, but a judgment. If one of your own donkeys were to fall into a well on the holy day, would you not immediately pull it out to save it? How is it, then, that a man, a soul made in the image of the Creator, is worth less to you than a beast of burden? His words were a hammer blow, shattering their facade of righteousness. I saw Theron's face tighten, a mask of fury and humiliation. He had lost, publicly, in front of hundreds. A surge of triumph coursed through me. Yes, I thought, expose them, show them who holds the true power. The fire of my own agenda roared back to life. The day of their judgment was near, and I, Kael, was ready to be its instrument. I did not realize the true trap had not been set for Elias. It had been closing around my own soul all along.
Bang.
The final breaking point, the event that pushed everything over a cliff, from which there was no return, came not from a confrontation, but from a friendship. Lyron, a dear friend of Elias and the brother of two sisters the teacher loved as his own, had fallen gravely ill. When the news reached us, we were in another province, a journey of several days away. The other disciples and I urged Elias to leave at once, but with a strange, unnerving calm, he waited 2 more days before we set out. His delay was a torment to me. Why? Why this apparent indifference to a friend in need? By the time we were on the road, a second messenger reached us with the news we had feared. Lyron was dead. He had been in the tomb for 4 days. When we finally arrived at his village, the air was heavy with the sounds of mourning. Lyron's sister ran out to meet us, her face ravaged by grief. She fell at Elias's feet, her words a heartbreaking accusation. Teacher, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And then I saw something I had never seen before. Elias wept. Tears streamed down his face. They were not tears of regret or powerlessness. I could feel it. They were tears of pure empathy, of taking the full, crushing weight of another's sorrow onto himself. My own heart ached. For the first time I saw him not as a figure of immense power, but as a man, a friend sharing in our grief. He asked to be taken to the tomb. It was a cave sealed with a massive stone. "Roll the stone away," he commanded. The sister cried out in alarm, "Teacher, no! It has been 4 days. Surely the stench, the decay." But Elias just looked at her, his gaze holding her. "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" Hesitantly, a few men put their shoulders to the great stone and rolled it aside, revealing a dark, cold maw from which a faint, foul air emanated. The crowd gasped and took a step back. Elias stood at the entrance. He performed no ritual, spoke no incantation. He simply took a deep breath and then he shouted, his voice a thunderclap of pure, undeniable authority, a command that shook the very air. "Lyren, come forth!" Silence. A second, 2, 3, each one an eternity. And then, from the blackness of the tomb, a figure emerged, stumbling into the light, a figure wrapped in white burial linens. It was Lyren. His eyes blinked against the sun, a look of dazed wonder on his face. He was alive. A collective scream of terror and awe erupted from the crowd. This was beyond anything. This was not healing. This was the reversal of death itself. It broke the fundamental law of existence. And in that moment, I knew. Everything had changed. This miracle was too vast, too public, too undeniable to be dismissed as a trick. The news would reach the synod within hours, and they would have no choice. They would have to destroy him. In the ensuing chaos of joy and fear, I saw him, the son of the elder who had destroyed Lyra. He had been in the crowd, a spy for his father. Our eyes met. He blanched and started to back away. The rage I had suppressed for so long exploded. This is it. In this pandemonium, no one would notice. I pulled the dagger from my tunic, the one I had sharpened every night, and I went after him. I cornered him in a narrow alley. He fell, begging for his life. My revenge, Lyra's justice, was finally within my grasp. And at that exact moment, I heard shouts in the distance. "The guards! The synod's guards are coming!" The final judgment had begun.
So,
It all happened in a blur. The guards descended like a tide of gray robes and glinting steel. The crowd scattered in terror. Some of the other disciples tried to fight, but Elias stopped them. He simply stood there, serene, and held out his hands to be bound. He offered no resistance. And in that alley, my world had shrunk to the space between my knife and my enemy's throat. His terrified pleading, the shouts from the street, the roar of vengeance in my own head. It was a symphony of chaos. One movement, that's all it would take. One thrust to end it all. But as I raised my arm, I heard Elias's voice, not from the street, but as if it were whispered directly into my soul. A strange, powerful connection opened between us. I saw what he saw. He was not being dragged to a public trial. He was brought before High Elder Theron, alone. A final, private confrontation. Theron sat on his ornate chair, his face a mask of cold triumph, trying to hide the tremor in his hands. "You fool," he sneered. "You have the power to call men back from the grave. Why not save yourself from my grasp?" Elias looked at him, and his eyes held no fear, only a deep, sorrowful compassion. "I know your pain, Theron," he said, his voice low and heavy, with a truth Theron had hidden his entire life. "I know you stood by, helpless, as your own wife wasted away from an illness your laws forbade you to treat. You couldn't heal her because it would have violated some minor statute. That fear, that impotence, it turned you into a jailer. You have imprisoned this entire kingdom and yourself within the cold stone walls of your heartless rules." The words struck Theron like a physical blow. The High Elder flinched, his mask cracking. In Elias's eyes he saw not an enemy, but a reflection of his own deepest failure. Then Elias's gaze seemed to shift, to look past the walls directly into the alley where I stood, and his voice rose, a clear, powerful command that was meant only for me. "Kael, the power to heal a dead body is as nothing compared to the power to forgive a living soul. The choice is yours. The choice was mine. Salvation or destruction, forgiveness or revenge, his way or mine. I looked down at the trembling man at my feet. I looked at the dagger in my hand, its polished blade reflecting my own rain-streaked, tear-stained face. I saw Lyra's face, but for the first time it was not a face demanding vengeance, it was a face at peace. A sob, raw and ragged, tore itself from my chest. The strength drained from my arm, the dagger fell from my grasp, clattering onto the wet stones. I had let go. I had forgiven. In that instant, the chains of hatred that had bound me for years shattered. A peace I had never known, a quiet, cleansing grace, flooded my soul. That was the miracle, the one meant for me. In his chamber, Theron sat stunned, not by Elias's supernatural power, but by the power of the forgiveness he had just witnessed. Elias smiled, a faint, weary but triumphant smile. His work was done. His legacy, the seed of true change, had been planted in the most fertile ground possible, a redeemed human heart, and he accepted his fate, whether death or exile, in silence.
Yeah.
Elias was executed. The synod declared the threat neutralized, the order restored. They sealed his tomb, posted guards, and believed they had buried a dangerous idea. They were wrong. 3 days later, the tomb was empty. There was no sign of a break-in, no body stolen. The seal was intact, the guards bewildered. We, his followers, came to understand. The empty tomb was not a physical parlor trick to awe the world. It was a metaphor. It meant that his spirit, his ideas, his radical love and forgiveness could not be contained by stone or by death. It had been set free. His legacy was not in that tomb. It was in us. It was in me. The old Kael had died in that alleyway with his dagger of vengeance. Now I had been healed, not of a physical ailment, but of the most soul-corroding disease of all. I, along with Reese and our brothers, took up his work. But we understood it differently now. We no longer went about trying to perform wonders. We walked into feuding villages, places where families had nursed hatred for generations, and we told them my story. We told them about my choice. We helped them reconcile. We built bridges where there had been walls. We taught that true strength wasn't in bending iron, but in bending one's own pride enough to forgive. Sometime later, we came to a valley stricken by a terrible famine. The people were hoarding what little they had, their eyes filled with suspicion. They begged us for a miracle, for bread to rain from the sky as their parents had told them it once did. But we had no such power. Instead, we did the only thing we could. We took out our own meager rations, gathered the people, and we shared them. Our small act shamed and inspired them. An old woman brought out a hidden potato. A family brought a handful of grain. Slowly, one by one, they began to share. They made a great communal soup, and for the first time in months, the whole valley ate together, a feast of trust. That night, watching the children sleeping with full bellies, Reese turned to me. "We performed a miracle today, Kael." I smiled and looked up at the star-filled sky. "No, Reese, our teacher never really left. He just multiplied himself into each of us. Every time we choose love over hate, sharing over hoarding, his echo, the echo of Ethel, is still here. This world is always searching for the grand miracle, for the man who walks on water, for the one who calls the dead from the grave. We crave external signs to fortify our belief. But after everything, after my long journey from a fisherman burning with hatred to a man who found peace, I have learned a greater lesson. I have learned that the greatest, most holy miracle is not the power to change the laws of nature. It is the power that resides in a single human being through a single choice to touch and change the nature of another. This was never the story of a God who walked among us to be worshipped. This is my confession of how a great teacher did not bestow power upon me, but instead showed me how to find it within myself. And more importantly, how to find that divinity in each other. If you have walked this entire journey with me, if this echo has resonated in some corner of your soul, perhaps it's no accident. Perhaps you too are searching for something deeper than what can be seen or proven. Our channel exists for that very reason, to explore the stories that find the extraordinary in the ordinary, that uncover strength in the moments of our greatest weakness. If you feel that connection, consider subscribing so we can continue to listen for life's other echoes together. Thank you for listening.